I'm Dr. Jim Hasik. I'm a research fellow at the Center for Government Contracting at George Mason University. We will get started because my boss, Jerry, there in the back of the room was reminding me a few minutes ago that we're actually about 15 minutes behind schedule. We have Secretary Lord coming in at 12:30, so we're going to try to move expeditiously. That's a little challenging because we're going to have a discussion now for the next hour about two topics integral to government contracting, to the business of buying for the public, that get to the issue of the understanding of what it is that we're buying when we buy, and how to leverage that understanding in order to get better results economically, militarily, with respect to security, both microscopically and macroscopically. We're going to talk about supply chain security, a topic, an issue that has become of a great deal of interest of late. It's not like it's never been there, but I think two trends over the last couple of decades, digitization, globalization, have made this more important now than it has been in the past. We're also going to talk about intellectual property, a topic that has become interesting. It was interesting to the last administration as well. But if you have the chance to go back and I'm going to give you a book idea, look for a book by a woman named Catherine Epstein from Rutgers University called Torpedo, that does a great job of explaining how it is that we've actually been interested in intellectual property and the procurement of defense material since about 1900. This has been a 120-year topic. It has coursed through the U.S. government's procurement bureaucracy in waves since then, and it suddenly has gotten more important. If not more important, at least a center of attention again. And the reason it's a center of attention again is because this gentleman to my left, Dr. Bruce Jette, the Army's acquisition executive, has promulgated a new policy on the topic. So what I'd like to do is to start off to ask you to make a statement about why this is interesting again, and then we'll run down the our panel with a couple other introductory statements about either IP or SC security. So what can you tell us, Dr. Jette?
So thanks, Jim. So intellectual property seems like it's one of those things that's a really boring event, and it's just generally not done well in the government. My perception from having been on the other side of the table for many years, for those of you who don't know my history, I was a program manager for a long time, retired from the Army, then I ran a company that I built up. Small company, but it was basically an engineering and development company, and so I have intellectual property from trade secrets, copyrights, and patents. And what I saw was just how badly we do things inside the government. And so when I had the opportunity to return to this position, I sort of made my top 10 list. And one of the top 10 was intellectual property. We need to manage that better. In your world, I'm sure you sit down, you sit across the table, you're going to establish a new partnership between your company and another company. First thing that gets slid across the table is a piece of paper for your non-disclosure agreements. Okay? In the government, that rarely happens. When it does happen, it doesn't mean anything because it's like, I don't speak Hungarian. So if you come and talk to me in Hungarian, I still don't understand you. So that's sort of my analogy when you start saying IP to the population of the government, because they don't know what you're talking about. The IP lawyers do, but the general people you deal with don't. So when I came in, I said, we need to establish an intellectual property policy that rewards those people who have invested in intellectual property, doesn't steal it from them. Yet when the government pays for the development of intellectual property, they not only own the intellectual property, they also have it delivered to them. In my experience on the outside, when I worked for other companies, and I'd do engineering or technology development, I do something, I generate intellectual property, I would deliver it to them, not just say, hey, I spent a lot of your money on research and development, and it's really good stuff, and here's a report. No, I had to deliver them the intellectual property. So what we've tried to do is put together a policy which is fair and balanced in both sides. It takes care of those things that are IP for the person who owns and developed at their expense that IP. Conversely, if I'm spending the money, the taxpayers' money to develop IP, I don't want to be unable in the future to be able to leverage that IP as is necessary. Our policy starts from the very beginning. We've done some work that now you should be seeing if you sit down with your anybody in the government. They should be putting some NDAs on the table, or you can bring an NDA and they can work through it. We want to look at intellectual property from the very beginning all the way back. In fact, we've got several contracts now where we've actually begun working on the ratings. My requirement is that for major contracts that might involve intellectual property, that within the pricing volume, you have to price the intellectual property. So you, just like you do commercially, identify what you say is intellectual property you own and give me the pricing long-term on what it would be. If you deserve a coverage and licensing fee for that forever, then let's get it out on the table. And it works all the way through to the very end, because really the issue is, how do I control my destiny in the far end? You talked about supply, and I just really quickly touch this. We're trying to, so if you think from contract development to logistical sustainment, we need this IP to be able to be the thread through this. There's almost a vertical thread right in the middle, which is I need, when I develop something, delivery of the IP in a format that can help me do something with it. I have a requirement to deliver when I build a vehicle, let's say. Give me the level 3 drawing package. It's a standard vehicle, probably stacks about that high. They're government formatted projections of every part in the vehicle. They were absolutely the right answer in 1965. They're not useless, but they're difficult to use for anybody in the modern world, because you feed 3D CAD into a machining system to be able to produce it. That goes into the supply chain. It gives us new capabilities. And so I need to change the way I look at the impact of my intellectual property, giving me a deliverable in a format where that IP is of value and helps us to reduce the supply chain. We'll have an additive manufacturing policy the Secretary will announce later this week.
Okay. I'm going to reverse this order a little bit. I want to talk to Katie next. Katie, you are the Special Assistant to the Assistant Secretary for Acquisition. You're the Special Assistant for Cyber.
I'm CISO for acquisition.
The CISO for acquisition.
No, it's all right.
Is this, we got your title
fine.
wrong.
It's no big deal.
Now
I'm
embarrassed.
cyber. I'm cyber.
You're the cyber person, okay.
Define it, you can't even see me.
Well, we've pinned you down a little bit. Can you tell us, Dr. Jette was saying, the world's a little bit different than it was in 1965. How far behind the curve are we in keeping up with where we need to be?
Well, I mean, so far it's, and if you don't understand why I say we're so far behind the curve, right? How do you think our adversaries target CFIUS cases? How do you think they know who are the most vulnerable companies within our supply chain, or your supply chain? How do they know who to target? We play, and I'm sorry, sir, because you are one of my heroes, right? But I'm going to say this, right? And I'm going to take 2 minutes and be liberal with my time.
You've got 2 minutes.
All right, ready. Acquisition today. Let's just level set the way we do acquisition versus the rest of the world. There are 2 teams, they come in, right? There's the allied team and the adversary team. The adversary team comes in, and the rule of the game is spitball. Everybody knows spitball, we had them in high school, right? The game is the most on the wall at the end of an hour. The allied team. The adversary team, the allied team, all the same exact makeup of people and capability, and no resources. break. You have 1 hour. The adversaries are running out and they're grabbing everything they can find. If they walk by a baby that's got a bottle of formula, they're ripping the formula from the baby. They're using Pampers, they're using paper towels, toilet paper, they don't care. They need water and they need paper. They don't care. And they just start launching. And us, the allied team. Leadership is important. We argue for 7 minutes about who's going to run the program. Then once we decide who is going to run the program, then we decide how we're going to resource that program. And when we resource that program, we have the scientists to decide what kind of water do we need, and are we getting the best water from the right supply chain. And then we have the same conversation about the paper. And then we have the same conversation arguing about the viscosity and how it should be mixed together. And then at the 30th minute, we add in trajectory and propulsion because it's important. We've got to be able to get it. Then at the 49th minute within our supply chain, we realize, wait a minute, does anyone know what the wall is where we're impacting? We've got to research that. At the 59th minute, we launch the most perfect spitball the world has ever known. It goes, it arcs exactly as we intended it to. It hits the wall, the impact, that ball is going to be on that wall for the next 100 years. And our adversaries win at the 60th minute because the war was not what we were fighting. It wasn't the game we were playing. Our acquisition is right now set up in a way that it's hard to be successful. Our supply chain is restricted. It is hard to see our supply chain. We talk about IP, and we talk about IP rights within each other, but we forget that our adversary is the largest purveyor of our IP. We have to secure our supply chain. We have to go back to basics, look at each other and say, these are the things that matter. Right now, security within the supply chain, ensuring that we as a nation are able to defend ourselves and our supply chain, and that it's not a you thing or a me thing, it's a we thing. Our adversaries get up every morning, and most of them have a nation state that says, I am the only thing that matters. So how far are we behind the curve? We have capitalism, bureaucracy that pull us in 10 different directions, all rightfully so. But our adversary has one goal, one mission. So how far behind are we? I mean, that's the egg that we're talking about. And how do we get collectively unified as an industry to do the right thing? So Dr. Jette's IP, DoD is going to be releasing a very similar IP policy. Ms. Cummings spoke about it last night. It's almost replicative. I mean, 6 tenants, I think yours were 4, you know, DoD, OSD. We love to add a couple of more, you know. But it's one of the things that we can say that we actually looked internally and said, great policy, great leadership, let's replicate it and get it and sprinkle it across the services. We need to have that kind of visibility into how do we secure our supply chain from our industry partners and within across the federal government to get good, sprinkle the goodness so we can function to protect ourselves in the matter that our adversaries do it. Sorry. Passionate?
Chief Information Security Officer, do I have that right? Katie, I got that right finally?
Yes.
Good, thank you. Okay, after that uplifting talk, let me go to figure out, maybe get another perspective on how far behind we are. I'm going to ask the big data guy. So, Chris Taylor, you're the CEO of Govini. I could characterize it this way: you tell business and government, you provide information for business and government about understanding government and business.
I don't say it exactly like that, but I am now. That was
Okay.
well done.
Thank you.
It might be Catherine. That's our new tagline.
Hello, Catherine. What is it that, if you're looking at this question in that kind of comprehensive big data, you know, you've got some detailed insights into supply chains.
Yeah.
You make your money off that. Can you give me a compare and contrast to how far behind are we? Where are the big issues?
Yes, I can. Let me do it with some context. Both Dr. Jette and Katie I agree with everything they just said. The only way that we achieve what either one of them want to achieve is with a data-first approach to this. Without the data, without access to data across the enterprise that's de-siloed and where we can extract the true value so that it gives keen insight that otherwise didn't exist, have to have a data-first approach. There is not a supply chain piece of work that we do where we have not surprised the crap out of the customer with what is there and with what is not there, and who is involved. Well,
Yeah.
it's bad, right? It's good work, we do great work, but it's bad, the results are bad. We're really far behind, and I think the point to hammer away on is that we all look at risk differently. Small businesses look at risk differently, big businesses look at risk differently, and then when they decide to do something about risk, they use different frameworks, mostly so that they can make themselves feel better that they've done something before the zero-day event is occurring to them. Like, we all want to feel better first and be able to point to something that we've done that may not be the thing that we should be doing, both for ourselves and for the greater good to protect the nation. Because Katie's point about well, I guess we can just not mince words. China has a whole of nation approach against the United States of America. Stop, period, put a period at the end of the sentence. That's it. It is a whole of nation approach against the United States of America. On the other hand, Wall Street has never seen a deal with China that they don't like. So at the macro level, I said it, so what? At the macro level, we have competing forces going on. And when that ultimately works its way down to a business that is a small business who might be service disabled veteran-owned small business, who's this young man or woman has put everything they have into an idea that then becomes their intellectual property. And as we start to move through what to do with intellectual property, who owns it and why, if industry doesn't understand clearly what government wants and needs from it and why, the P word they're going to use is not partnership, it's going to be premium. They're going to charge a premium for that. I don't know what's going to happen to me, but I'm going to get some money in my pocket while I'm doing it. So as Katie's efforts and certainly Dr. Jette's efforts work their way through the building and then into industry, the conversation really has to be easily understandable. Keep it simple, stupid, right? So that we can absolutely understand and make the adjustments that we need, because the things that we're doing now do not work. Do not work. I know the number is 600 billion, or how much have we lost in intellectual? I don't even know how you quantify it. Annually. I don't, is that the number? How many stars are in the sky? You know what I mean? What I do know is that every time we do something, our great power competitors do something else. This is not, I've just discovered the thing that will prevent. It's constant vigilance. And so what is the price of constant vigilance against both the nation's security and the economics and prosperity of all the businesses that support national security? Once we work that out, I think we'll be in a much better place. And I said to Katie before we came on that in 20 years, I have not seen the building moving this quickly, this aligned around things that actually matter. In 20 years, I think it's the best effort the Pentagon has put forth, starting 3 or 4 years ago, to right some of these things that are happening to us.
I should mention some of these concerns do predate the current administration. The current administration has had a great deal of emphasis on it, but that has been a building torrent. Along the way, Dr. Jette, you mentioned that you are not actually an IP lawyer, but conveniently we have an IP lawyer on our panel. That is to say, I'm sorry, Vicki, you are the learning director for intellectual property at the Defense Acquisition University. You teach at the DAU. You have also taught at the University of Texas, my alma mater. Thank you. Maybe you could tell us, there is a new policy. There are a lot of there's a new policy. There are old concerns on the IP side, on the supply chain side. What do you like about whether it's the policy or the specific policy or the general direction of policy from your vantage point, thinking about the law?
I think the policies are good, and I'm speaking from the perspective of a lawyer who was involved in intellectual property enforcement for over 17 years on the international scene. I was an international trade lawyer, an intellectual property lawyer involved in negotiating some of the multilateral and bilateral trade agreements with both China and some of our other adversaries. And I think if you look at the problem of using intellectual property and data as a strategic defense posture, which is what I think is going on, we saw that coming sort of 20 years ago. China joined, and I hate to use China as an example. There are certainly other countries that are examples who joined the World Trade Organization. The whole purpose of joining that organization is to put policies in place within and domestic laws in place within those countries to protect and enforce intellectual property. That's sort of the broader trade policy goal. Well, if you look at putting those policies in place, that's one thing. The second thing is the political will behind really the enforcement part of that. And I think that's where you see the issue is the lack of political will, and the lack of political will because the use of data and intellectual property is really part of the adversary's overall strategic defense posture. So that's the environment we're living in. Now, we live in a global economy. We didn't have this problem in the 1980s when we didn't have a global supply chain. Also, we live in a digital economy where access to sensitive data that can be used, we didn't have that issue. But that's the landscape that we're currently in, and that's not going to change. So if that's not going to change in terms of how we deal with that from an intellectual property standpoint, I think within the government, you're going to hear me say this a lot, we have to really, we have the policies there, which are great, but we have to educate our workforce in developing an intellectual property strategy. And I know that's something that is a document that's going to come out of the Office of Secretary of Defense at some point. But when you look at an intellectual property strategy, really having all of the stakeholders at the table to understand what are you acquiring, what's the nature of the technology, where are you getting it from, if it's commercial technology, who's the vendor, who are the vendors, who are their likely supply chains, where is that coming from, what are you going to do with the technology in both the short term and the long term, and then having all of the stakeholders at the table to vet those issues. I think the supply chain issue is sort of part of that overall vetting process. And I know we have lots of policies and processes in places that our industry partners have to comply with, and processes and procedures that we should have in place within the government to vet to make sure that they're complying with those policies. I've heard a lot about sort of processes and compliance and sort of, what a difficult issue that is, and if we're putting all that bureaucracy in there, whether that hampers our ability to do what we need to do. And I say that those processes and policies are all there, but the lack of the strategic thinking is where the issue is, and that we really have to work on doing that, working with our industry partners, whether it's through education, and I'm an educator, so that's something that we're certainly looking at, education, training our workforce to think like that, training them on these new technologies that will come out, and the intellectual property issues that those technologies will raise, but also partnering and collaborating with industry. And so that's something that we're looking at doing at the university, is creating sort of an industry partner sort of collaboration or partnership on learning assets, so that we talk about sort of what the industry issues are when you look at intellectual property acquisition, whether it's in the supply chain issue, but also what are the government issues. And if there are different perspectives, because if you look at intellectual property is an asset of a company. That's a valuable asset. So we want to respect that asset, but also be able to get what we need in terms of accomplishing our mission. And so in order to deal with all of these issues, I think education, I think collaboration, I think information sharing, and I think working with industry. And I think the supply chain issue is a part of that whole process. You have those policies and processes in place, but it's the next step. Now, I constantly ask, is this a cultural change? Yes, it is a culture change, yes. But our world is not going to go back to the 20th century. It's not going to change, so this is the world we live in. So I think we have to go forward with that culture change and all work together to address these issues, because it's not going to get any easier with technology.
Let me ask a follow-up, actually, of maybe any of the other three of you all, that I'm thinking about previous panelists, that is to say previous speakers today. I could draw a couple of basic lessons. Well, We're going to get another trillion in the hole this year. We've got an adversarial, state with 1.3 billion citizens. It's got a whole of government approach against us. Those two things together don't sound great, except that they're actually deeper in the hole than we are. We have to be judicious about resources, and yet we have big security problems. We have the promise, and also we have the expense, and we have the danger of what we might do to industry if we are too aggressive or we're not aggressive enough about securing intellectual property. What kind of practical guidance, maybe Dr. Jette, you could give us some indications about your thinking on how do you provide practical guidance to the bureaucracy on how much you need, talk about intellectual property, how much do you need, where do you need it from, and how much should you be willing to pay for it?
So that's a really good question. It's kind of interesting right now. There are three acquisition executives, service acquisitions executives. Anno Gertz and Will Roper and I have known each other for a long time, and we're actually kind of friends with each other. So we talk to each other. Each of the services have somewhat of a different approach. Some of them want to own more. I want to own what's right. Frankly, if you're going to bid a contract and you're going to bid your box into the middle of this thing, then when you bid it, I want to know what the goes in is, the goes out is, and the function of that box is, and what's the licensing arrangement. If it's got hardware or software in it and it's yours, then declare it just like you would have to do in any commercial contract, because I want to protect it. At the same time, I want to protect us, so the taxpayer in the execution of the program. So when you bid that and you bid that functionality, you got to lay it out. What does it do? Why should I want it? How much are you going to charge? Who's going to upgrade it? Who's going to take care of it? What if it needs patches for software, things like that? Is that my bill now? Well, wait a minute, I'm paying you a licensing fee, but now I have to maintain it too. We're going to have a different discussion about the licensing fee. So those type of things are the type of things that we need to look at the front end, because we need to honor the people who did the work and developed it on their own. On the other side,
you were saying you've done this yourself?
Yes,
you know what it's like?
I own intellectual property, and anybody interested in some, we can talk later. I'm looking for some licensing opportunities. So you want it, that brings the small industry, because large industry have assets, real estate, big buildings with their names on them and stuff. Innovative small companies have what's in their head and what's on a piece of paper. So being able to bring them in and have them help us with the innovation means I've got to honor their intellectual property. But the minute I steal it, my reputation goes out the window, and other people with innovations won't come to me because they know I'm going to dump their secrets out.
And has this been a problem for us?
Oh, absolutely, sure.
Okay.
So I think the first thing, so we have two pieces to the policy that we put out. One is the policy itself. The second one is an implementation plan. And the implementation plan is trying to address your issue of how do we educate them. Like I said, you sit down, you speak to a lot of the people in the government, you start talking about intellectual property. First thing they think is, well, everything I've ever seen is mine. Because that's how we behave. I always would tell people, if you're going to tell the government something, just go ahead and publish it on a piece of paper and stick it to the side of the Washington Memorial or something, because everybody's going to know it. Okay? If you in fact are going to change that culture and have people honor intellectual property and pay for the proper ones and take delivery of those things which you paid for, and not wait until years later. I know of a particular system that we developed, 100% of the government's money went into it. I'm going to guess, maybe 15 years after its development, we had left it in the hands of the contractor to keep it updated. We paid for all the updates, and then at a point we asked for delivery of the IP. and they wanted $65 million. Now, if you're going to be doing that, if you're going to be maintaining and updating the IP and all the drawings, all
This
all
was
the technology.
IP that the government owned.
Yes.
But you needed,
Well, we owned it.
yeah, but
We
you
owned
needed
it.
the
We
drawings,
just
so
never
to
had it
speak, or the
delivered.
models, right.
So if I want it delivered, but I didn't think about it at the beginning, they wanted $65 million for me to have it delivered. Now, they had to have it in a drawer someplace because you were using it as a engineered baseline. So it was going to cost me $65 million, not me, actually, another program manager. But they were going to actually charge the government $65 million to run the copy machine. You've got to get that into the head of the people who are thinking at the front end of the contract who've never had to deal with these things. I need to think about that out here so that as I come along, I don't run into a $65 million bill for letting somebody run a copy machine. And I'm hamstrung if I don't pay the bill. Or I'm stuck with that contractor.
I'm noticing Chris has a thought.
So I've heard 10 million nightmare stories like Dr. Jette just told, right?
Do you have some positives, some success stories?
Yeah, so I'll tell you about it. Our business, we're in data. Sometimes the Pentagon leases our data. And instead of, there's two ends of the spectrum. One end of the spectrum in data is, I paid for the license, I just assume the license is in perpetuity, and I can do with it what I want to have. No, that's not how data leasing works in the business. Nor is it that I should lease it, that I should charge you when you stop using it because there's innate value that's created in data over time, blah, blah, blah. So one of the things we did to sort of improve our partnership with the Pentagon was said, look, we'll do this. If you agree to lease the data for 5 years so that I know that I can recoup what I put into it, I make a fair margin on that. At 5 years, there's no breakup fee. It's yours. You can do with it what you want, whatever you want. But the sticky part with data particularly is that if you don't do that, the Pentagon, the Royal Pentagon, the writ large, doesn't like this whole, because the systems are so crazy intertwined, doesn't like this, hey, if you're not leasing the data anymore, you have to remove it from your system and destroy it. That drives them crazy. I don't want to spend my time fighting with the Pentagon about what to do with the data. Let's move along in a fair fashion that says, if you pay X for the data and we have a good partnership over time and the SLAs are working and people don't have to do, you shouldn't, if you're leasing something, you shouldn't have to also pay for all of the updates. But if we come to a good, fair way so that there is a breakup time, we ameliorate all of these problems. If the fight is going to be, I own it from day one, or you don't own it, the government says I own it from day one, or the vendor says, no, when the day you stop paying it for it, you can't do anything with it, you have to destroy it, we're never going to get anywhere. And data is the lifeblood of how we're moving forward in the 21st century. 100%, it is the lifeblood of what we're doing. Sorry.
Katie.
Go ahead.
So 100% agree, right? But to your point, and small business, right? They are the lifeblood of innovation. And how are we protecting them? So exfils happen, right? And we all talked about a unified state coming at us. The people that are doing some of the most innovative, groundbreaking work don't have the capability, right, to protect themselves against the nation state attacking them. And it behooves us, right, in the Department of Defense to look to how do we find ways to protect everybody. We've been talking about supply chain, right? And your company, sir, I'm big, like the company. To help with, no, I like the company, it's a good name, but to help those small businesses, right, maintain their IP, to get the best value out of the taxpayer dollar that we're putting into it, we need to have tools illuminated to help do that. No matter who holds the IP, right, if our adversary gets it, it does, cost, schedule, and performance, right? Does it matter how much it costs if our adversary has the same like capability or they've out-technologied us? That's a word, right? Out-technologied? It doesn't matter the performance of a particular product if our adversaries, it meets all the requirements, but by the time we get it to the warfighter, we put it into operation, it's been outperformed. Or schedule, if it meets the day. And we have to look at, a holistic approach on how are we going to protect what the government is paying for in IP, no matter who's doing it, and ensure that that capability is protected. And that's, one of the things I think we have to really look at is it's a big part, IP, understanding, and to Dr. Jette's point, the start. But we have a lot of programs, hundreds, thousands of programs that are already in life cycle. And that IP kind of conversation's kind of lost already. We can't really get that back. How are we going to protect what we've got is a conversation of, trying to, the supply chain side of it, how do we do that? How do we illuminate to let people in program offices realize your IP that your supplier has been contracted to provide to you is at risk? And how do we help illuminate that to keep the proprietariness and the independent nature of it so that companies, small businesses can survive and maintain and do good work for the government? I'm sorry, I just had to add that.
Amen.
And just another piece as part of that, I think all of the things you're talking about, you're still getting back to sort of that strategic thinking up front, but you have to have all of the players at the table. And I think that's what's missing a lot in the acquisition process that I've seen. You've got to have the IP lawyer, if there's an IP lawyer there, or...
There should always be an IP lawyer.
And
right?
I'm always an
Right.
IP lawyer. Your contracting attorney, your program manager, your technical SME, your contracting officer, all of the folks need to be at the table, and I often say early and often, to sort of vet these issues and have these discussions. I think that's a big part of what's missing as we do our acquisitions. When I went into my old agency, that's one of the things that I saw. There were so many contracts that people come to me and say, well, do we have the rights to the intellectual property? And we didn't, because we didn't have these discussions. But as I say again, it has to be a cultural change, it has to be all the stakeholders at the table, and it will take a lot of educating to get folks to think like this. There was one piece about valuation of intellectual property that came up, and we know sort of looking at the valuation of intellectual property as part of the contracting process, we realize that that's an educational gap that's missing. So at DAU, we're working to put together some sort of educational learning asset on that topic so that we look at that as part of the overall contracting process and we understand it.
So this is a pretty sophisticated audience. Let me ask you, how do you think about the valuation of IP differently when, that is to say, let's think about it from the business standpoint. How does a business think about it differently if the counterparty is not another business, but rather is your government? Have you all thought about that at DAU?
Well, the way we've looked at it is, if we're looking at an overall as part of our contracting price, that a company is going to...
I'm sorry, that's also a way of answering the question, is
Right.
to think about it from the government.
Right.
How do you value IP differently if you're government and not a business?
The way we're looking at it now is understanding how companies value, because it is a business proposition. When you look at sort of the literature, you see that businesses look at that issue all the time in terms of the value of their intellectual property. So for us to understand is, what's the methodology? How are companies looking at it from a business standpoint so that we can decide what we need to look at in terms of our overall contracting process, how that's going to factor into the price. So we are currently looking at it, because that's how it's typically done in intellectual property, is valuation from a business side of it. Now, I think from a government side, if you look at it sort of as a broader sort of holistic issue, what does the value of that IP in terms of what we are trying to accomplish, in terms of our mission, again, I go back to the short and long term, as part of the overall acquisition process, where does that IP fall into that? And as an IP lawyer, I think that's the bread and butter of the technology, really, the technology products. So what is how do you value it in terms of what we're trying to accomplish overall? That's the government standpoint. But I think our perspective now is to really understand sort of the business perspective part of that. And as part of our discussions and collaboration with industry to understand how they value IP and how they factor that into their contracting price, so that overall what we're really looking for, I think, is to educate the workforce that intellectual property is really a balance. It's a balance of respecting industry's intellectual property, but also being able to get the technology that DoD needs to accomplish its mission. I also want to put a plug that DoD has done a video on the Army's IP policy and guidance that will come out on our website. So.
I would offer that there's some complexity in what Vicki says, only that if we didn't have this discussion, we asked everybody who's from industry here today, give me the characteristics of your IP, they would say, it increases in value every day, right? Because that's it. It is what industry would say back to the government. Government, as Dr. Jette said, will ask for a line in a response to an RFP that says, tell me the value of your IP. It's the machinations that industry will go through to put the number that they want there, but that can also be acceptable to government, is a lot. It's quite a bit, because they're going to say, well, the value of the IP in this particular instance is X, but you know, this IP actually services 4 other parts of things that we do, and it has a value as well, and it's ever increasing. I think, to Vicki's point about bringing everybody to the table so that we can get common definitions of what IP means, IP value means, common definitions of what the supply chain is. Listen, I have conversations every single day. Nobody gives me the same definition of supply chain. The easiest thing to say is from the ground to the platform. Okay. If you trace that in some of the systems that we have, that's quite a bit of activity. Lots of people who do supply chain analysis, for instance, will get you to 3rd or 4th tier suppliers, and we think that that's an 80% solution, it's good enough, nothing's going to happen. When in fact, we find, so great power competitors, particularly to Katie's point about how CFIUS cases, how people choose to self-elect CFIUS cases, if they have done their analysis and say they're paying attention down generally to the 4th or 5th tier suppliers in the supply chain, I just moved what I want to do down here to the 9th, 10th tier of the supply chain. More data, more analysis, a clear view all the time is what we have to move to. Otherwise, we're lying to ourselves. We're making ourselves feel very comfortable that we've done something. There's a policy. We had a conference. We talked about it on stage. I only have to go to the 4th level, and next thing you know, Armageddon. Not really.
Let me ask you a specific question. If you have noticed this, and if you've noticed it, Katie, if you've noticed it, I'm going to say something that I learned about. I got the unclassified version. And there's also been some writing about this in the international security literature, that there are American military procurement programs, making actual weapon systems, where if you drill down a couple levels, 4th, 5th tier, you realize that there's a part going into that weapon system that is made in the People's Republic of China. And there's a question then about whether or not that corporate entity, or possibly a little mom and pop shop, somewhere in Guangdong province, actually understands who their ultimate customer is. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But how much of a problem does this seem to be? This study I saw dated back to 2011, so it's been a known problem for a little while, or a known issue, let me put it that way. How much of a problem is it? Can either one of you comment? And what can or should be done about it from a supply chain security standpoint?
It's only a problem until we decide that it's a problem, right? Like if we just say everything in the supply chain is bad, we're never going to accomplish anything. With the proper frameworks, with the proper continuous monitoring, with the proper partnership between government and industry, and a clear, I just can't stress enough, a clear view of everything across the enterprise, you get to decide what's a problem, so DCSA can say, that kind of scares me, so it now just became a CI thing. It's not a government and a counterintelligence thing. It's not It's not just a procurement thing, although that's part of it. I'd like to go check that out. It's probably not good enough to say China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, bad. Anything coming from there should never be anything in our supply chain because we work in a global supply system and maybe not everything. But we damn sure should know it, and we should understand all the concentric circles around it. And if it really does bother us, figure out another way to get it out of the supply chain and do something else with it.
We know that there's, and to think that there's not instances where something is getting into our system. I mean, the DIB is 20,000 companies. The supply chain is like 300,000 companies, right? It's huge. We absolutely know. But I think the bigger conversation needs to be, risk is always going to be in our supply chain. There's no way around that, right? The best thing that we can do is, I go to a very tactical, you've got to know what your network looks like, and you've got to know what you're protecting. When it comes to our supply chain, we need to harness the data that's available. We need to bring in the analytical pieces, the open source information that we can combine with the government extra super special stuff infused together to give us real-time information so that we can do our best to protect the supply chain, not just about a part that may be a sole source supplier in China. That may not be a risk, right? That's not the risk in the supply chain, but we don't even know what risk, to earlier conversations, what risk means to you, what risk means to me, what risk means to the procurement officer. We have to have that illumination, I use that word, the supply chain illumination, so we can decide, okay, that manufacturer, got it, we can mitigate that risk, we can watch it. We can also do continuous monitoring. If it's an IP issue, right, and we know that a small business has a particular IP that they are doing that is very innovative and needed and niche for the government, we need the capability to protect it. For both sides, we need that small business to be able to maintain their IP and what makes them unique, but we need to be able to help them. I mean, we know that there are instances, that's a given. How we look at risk, how we mitigate it, I think is the bigger question that we have to have. And if something happens to someone's IP, how do we react as an industrial base around that? Because it's not, and I'll use company X is creating widget Y for us, and somehow that's compromised, right? Not only is company X out, right, the money that they've put into it, the investment, but we're out the resource. So we have to bring together and start using these tools that are out there that we currently have within the government, but within industry, to have a collaborative conversation. I mean, the big thing is this: we're not going to solve this supply chain issue with just the government. It's got to be a collaboration, and understand that we're all trying to protect each other's IP and to make sure that what we bought, we actually have access to in the right time, that it's been protected, and that we're using it in the manner to which we needed it.
I think what you're really doing is sort of evaluating, assessing, and managing that risk is what you're doing.
Did you want to add? We have a few minutes left.
I just you wanted some positive comments, so
Sure.
So one of the things I would say is that with respect to critical technologies, weapon systems, weapons themselves, missiles, things like that, each PM and PEO have specific cyber requirements and cybersecurity requirements. When I say cyber, I'm not just talking about some network connection issue. I'm talking right down to the chip and the sourcing of the chips and assuredness that the chip, in fact, is not infected with something that we did not expect. The boards are designed in such a way that they're actually delivered compliant with the original design structure, so that you didn't have, a spare chip on that board. You didn't know.
Oh, I heard about
that. So we, we know the many methodologies that are readily understood on the public sector, and we know some of the methodologies that are not so well understood. We apply those, and the PMs and PEOs, certainly in the Army, and I'm sure in the other services as well, have the obligation to continuously vet their systems from bottom to top.
Sure.
They have structure to do that. Then we, at the Army level, have structures as well. We use the National Lab Systems on occasion to come in and check us. And we have red and blue teams. we actually try to hack our own stuff to see if we can find a backdoor we didn't know was there. Or so we do many things in many ways to try and preclude us from having a problem with some of those issues. There's also we have a secure foundry. So there are a handful of things we don't let anybody else produce. And so we produce them ourselves.
Sure.
So the supply chain on certain critical things, knowing that nothing is perfect is pretty tight. And when we finally sort of went, oh, crud, we better fix this, it's a lot of grass to mow. Now we just have to look for the patches, and we keep the yard a little tidier. So it is an encouraging thing. I was far more worried. I think the biggest vulnerability we have is not so much that side of things, but just taking all of our stuff and putting it on the plan for a board inside of a weapons system that we really don't want anybody to know about is 18 layers down in some supply chain on somebody's laptop. And the next thing you know, somebody finds a way into that laptop, finds the board design, and boom, they've got now the internal design, which is a different problem of vulnerability than it is I stuck a rogue chip into it. That's the part that the supply chain problem becomes. Because I have no idea how I can get defense industry quality or Department of Defense quality security into Bob's motherboard company.
Funny you should mention that. So there are things, so to the Army's point, I think Army and Navy lead in the services on cyber, right? The Navy Cyber Readiness Review, the Army has been putting cyber requirements in their contracts, the cyber hardening KPPs that we're putting in. I'll say that we're rewriting the 5,000 to put more cyber requirements and instruction and guidance within our PMs on how they're creating new programs. For getting industry set, we've taken the initiative on how do we get them, the supply chain level set on cybersecurity. We've got the CMMC rolling out the cybersecurity maturity model certification. That is going to level set the industry on making sure that that 15th tier supplier at least is certified and qualified to do the work that we've imparted on them. The part on the government side is we've put too much, as Dr. Jette just said, we've put too much information down the pipe without giving the right rigors of how to protect it as it goes down. It's not out of malice intent, but sometimes as small businesses especially, program managers get tasked out on different ones. I was a program manager on 3, that one was working on the grid, one was working on natural resources and water, and one was doing the FAA Doppler radar. Independently, those weren't a problem, right? They were all unclassified, but put together, compiled, it was a classified laptop. And we need to help better those small businesses get to that level. So CMMC is still rolling. We're rocking on that one to level set the industry standards. But in the meantime, I applaud what Army, Navy, Air Force are doing in putting cyber requirements in contracting, trying to make it very real, one-to-one, what we need. Sorry.
No, I just want to look back to my friend and colleague Charlie to ask, is Secretary Lord here? Ah, okay, well, we should wrap up then. I think we have, I feel like I've been having all the fun. This is an august panel. If we have time, we should take a question, because it gives somebody an opportunity to ask something that's just burning it on your mind, right? I could use this thing, but somebody could just pop up a hand. And if not, that's okay. Oh, absolutely, we're going to let him go. Okay.
We've been talking about doom and gloom internally. 2 things to think about.
Sure.
One is, in the midst of all of this, we still need America's very best and brightest companies and entrepreneurs to support the national security of the United States of America. If none of you have ever seen Steve Blank's video on YouTube called The Secret History of Silicon Valley, I would encourage you to watch the video. Silicon Valley is catching a bunch of crap lately, and in some, deservedly so in some cases, but if they understood their own history and how
Oh,
they've
we know where
already
they came from.
contributed to us. The other thing is, and this might be a little more doom and gloom, I should have reversed these, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's not only tragically people from the outside getting into our supply chain and exfilling data. Tragically, we come across cases where it's our own citizens who sometimes decide to do bad acts, and they're selling stuff on the dark web and things of that nature. So when we talk about supply chain security, it's internal as well. It's not just external penetration. It's internal, I hate to say insider threat, but it's more than that. But we should be thinking
domestic
about that
problem.
as well. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. This has been a wonderful time. We will move on to our next keynote.